There are moments in history that refuse to stay buried. Moments that linger in the air long after the cameras have gone, long after the headlines have faded, long after the world has moved on to the next tragedy. These are the final moments, the last breaths, the last words, the last choices made by people who had no idea that time had already run out for them. And when we pull back the curtain on what really happened in those final hours, what we find is not always what we were told. Some of these stories were shaped by panic, by power, by people who had reasons to keep the truth locked away. But the truth has a way of surviving. It always does. So tonight we open the file, we go back to the beginning, and we follow the thread all the way to the end, to the exact moment where everything stopped. What you are about to hear is not sensationalized. It is not dramatized for effect. It is simply what happened, told with the weight and gravity it deserves. Because these were real people, and their final moments deserve to be understood, not just remembered. To understand what happened at the end, you have to understand how it all began. Every story of a final moment has a long shadow stretching behind it. Years, sometimes decades of choices, circumstances, and quiet warning signs that nobody stopped to read. History is full of these patterns. People who were failed by the systems around them. People who were pushed to the edge slowly, incrementally, until one day the edge simply gave way. And the world looks up from whatever it was doing and asks, how did we not see this coming? The answer, almost always, is that someone did. Someone saw it. Someone knew. And for reasons that range from negligence to deliberate silence, the warnings were ignored. That is perhaps the most haunting thread that runs through every story of a final moment, not the moment itself, but everything that came before it that could have changed the outcome. The ordinary days, the missed calls, the doors that were closed when they should have been opened. It is a pattern as old as time, and it is a pattern we are still repeating. Consider what it means to be in a final moment and not know it. Most people who have ever lived through a last day did not know it was their last. They woke up the way they always did. They made coffee, or they didn't. They argued about something small, or they laughed at something stupid on the television. They made plans for tomorrow, plans for next week, plans for a future that was already gone. There is something profoundly devastating about that image. The human mind is simply not built to comprehend its own ending. We are wired to keep going, to assume that tomorrow will come the way it always has. And so in their final moments, many of these people were not afraid. They were not preparing. They were simply living, and then, without warning, they were not. The violence of that transition from ordinary life to absolute stillness is something that the people left behind carry with them for the rest of their lives. Let us talk about the specific anatomy of a final moment, because it is rarely as dramatic as the movies make it look. In documented cases, in the accounts of survivors, in the testimonies of first responders and witnesses, what emerges again and again is a strange quality of normalcy right up until the very last second. People who survived plane crashes have described the moments before impact as eerily quiet. People who witnessed accidents on the street have described a kind of slow motion stillness, a pause in the world before the collision. Soldiers who survived ambushes described the seconds before the shooting started as some of the most peaceful moments they had ever known. Birdsong, sunlight, the smell of earth. The world does not announce its cruelties. It does not ring a bell or sound an alarm. It simply shifts, suddenly and without mercy, from one state to another. And the people caught in that shift have no time to understand what is happening to them. This is what makes the study of final moments so important and so difficult. Because to truly understand what happened, you have to be willing to sit in that discomfort. You have to be willing to step into the last hours of another person's life and look at the world through their eyes. You have to ask not just what happened, but what it felt like, what they were thinking, what they wish they had said or done differently. And when you do that, when you really allow yourself to go there, something shifts inside you. Because suddenly these are not statistics. They are not case numbers or historical footnotes. They are people, fully alive, right up until the moment they weren't. There is a particular category of final moment that history returns to again and again, the kind where the person at the center of the story knew, on some level, that the end was near. Not necessarily that they would die that day, or that week, but that the world they were living in was closing in on them. Leaders who had made powerful enemies, activists who had received threats that nobody took seriously, explorers who had pushed too far into territory that did not want to be explored, artists who had said too much, published too much, revealed too much. These people often left behind something remarkable, a letter, a recording, a conversation with someone close to them that in retrospect reads like a goodbye that was never meant to be one. And when those words are set against the backdrop of what came next, they carry a weight that is almost unbearable to sit with. Take the accounts of those who were there, the friends, the colleagues, the family members who spent time with someone in what turned out to be their final days. Almost universally, they describe a person who seemed, on the surface, completely normal. Maybe a little tired, maybe a little quieter than usual, but nothing that sent up a real alarm. And then the call comes, or the knock on the door, and suddenly every ordinary detail from those final days becomes significant. The way they hugged you when they left, the way they paused at the door and looked back for just a second longer than usual, the thing they said that you thought was strange at the time, but that you brushed off because you were in a hurry, because life was busy, because you had no reason to believe that was the last time, that pause at the door. That last look back, it never leaves the people who witnessed it. They carry it with them like a photograph that never fades. What the investigations that follow these moments often reveal is a timeline that should have gone differently. A series of decisions made by multiple people at multiple points along the way that, had even one of them been made differently, might have changed everything. A call that was made but not returned. A document that was filed but never reviewed. A report that was written and then quietly buried by someone who found its conclusions inconvenient. These are not conspiracy theories, they are documented realities, and they point to something deeply uncomfortable about the way institutions and systems function, that they are not designed to protect individuals, they are designed to protect themselves. And when those two things come to conflict, the individual almost always loses. The final moments of people who found themselves in the crosshairs of larger forces, political, institutional, or criminal, often share a specific quality, a sudden and terrifying realization that help is not coming, that the system that was supposed to protect them has either failed or was never really on their side to begin with. There is a particular kind of fear in that realization, not just the fear of physical danger, but the deeper, more isolating fear of being utterly alone in a world that has turned its back. And it is that loneliness, more than any other detail, that stays with you when you examine these cases closely, because most of these people were not alone. They had families, friends, colleagues, communities. But in their final moments, the thing that stands out most is how completely isolated they were from all of it. We should also talk about the stories that never make it to the surface at all. Because for every final moment that becomes a headline, there are dozens, hundreds, that disappear quietly into the dark. People whose deaths were ruled accidents when the evidence pointed elsewhere. People who vanished without a trace, and whose cases were closed too quickly, too conveniently by people who had reasons to want them closed. These are the files that gathering dust in the corners of archives. These are the cases that dedicated investigators and journalists sometimes spend years trying to crack open, not because they are chasing fame or sensation, but because somewhere along the way, a person was failed, a person deserved better, and the very least the world can do for them now is to look clearly at what happened and refuse to look away. Looking clearly is hard. It is much easier to accept the official version of events, to trust that the people in charge of telling us what happened are telling us the whole truth. But history, documented, verifiable, undeniable history, tells us that this trust is not always warranted. And so the work of telling these stories honestly, with care and without sensationalism, becomes not just a journalistic act, but a moral one. To look at a person's final moments and say, this matters, You mattered. What happened to you deserves to be known. That is, at its core, what this kind of storytelling is about. There are things that the people we remember for their final moments wanted the world to know. Things they said in interviews, wrote in journals, recorded in messages that only surface later. And what is striking, across so many different stories, so many different circumstances, is how consistent the human desire is in the face of mortality, not to be forgotten. That is the deepest fear and the deepest hope that runs through almost every documented final moment. Not just the fear of death itself, but the fear that it will have meant nothing, that the world will simply move on unchanged, as if they were never here. And so they spoke, and they wrote, and they recorded, leaving traces of themselves behind, as if they somehow understood that the world would one day need to hear what they had to say. We have a responsibility to those voices, to hear them clearly, to carry what they left behind not as morbid curiosity, but as something closer to witness, because to witness is to acknowledge that something real happened, to say, I see you, I hear you, I understand that your ending was not the whole story. And in that act of witnessing, something important happens. The darkness loses just a little of its power. The silence breaks just slightly. And the person who was lost is, in some small but significant way, found again. What really happened in their final moments is not always a story of failure or tragedy, though it is often both. Sometimes it is a story of extraordinary courage of people who, in the last minutes of their lives, made choices that protected others, or told truths that mattered, or simply refused to surrender to fear. Those stories exist too, and they are just as important to tell, because they remind us that the final moment is not always a passive thing. Sometimes it is a choice. Sometimes, even at the very end, a person looks the world in the eye and decides, this is who I am, this is what I stand for, and that decision echoes long after they are gone. The echo is what we are left with. In every final moment, there is an echo, a reverberation that continues through time, shaping the world in ways that the person who created it may never have imagined. Some of those echoes are quiet. Some of them are deafening. But they do not fade. They live in the people who love them, in the journalists and investigators who refuse to let their stories be buried, in the audiences who take the time to listen and to care, and to carry the weight of what they have learned. That is the strange and solemn gift of these stories. They ask something of us. They ask us not just to watch, but to remember, not just to be moved, but to remain moved, to let what we have learned change something in the way we move through the world. Because the world is still full of people standing at the edge of their own final moments without knowing it. People who need systems to work correctly. People who need someone to return the call, to review the report, to take the warning seriously. People who need the world to be paying attention at exactly the right time. And perhaps that is the most important thing that these stories leave us with, not just grief and not just anger, though both of those are entirely appropriate, but a kind of vigilance. A willingness to pay attention, to look a little harder at the things we might otherwise let slide, to ask the harder question, to take the longer look, because that attention, that sustained, deliberate, human attention is the only thing that has ever changed the pattern, and the pattern desperately needs to change. The final moments are over, but the story is not. It never really is. And as long as there are people willing to dig into the dark, willing to hold a light up to the corners of history that powerful people would rather keep shadowed, the truth will continue to surface. Slowly, sometimes painfully, but inevitably, because that is the nature of truth. It waits, it endures, and eventually it finds its way into the light for everyone to see. If you believe that stories like these deserve to be told, that the people behind them deserve to be remembered with honesty and with care, then stay with us. There is more to uncover, more to understand, more darkness to bring into the light. This is Dark Files, and we are just getting started. If you enjoy dark stories like this, subscribe to Dark Files for more.